The night Cara Ricci first sat at the Vitali table, she wore white. It was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most naive. She still wasn't sure which. White at a Vitali dinner. White among men who wore their sins like custom-tailored suits, who poured their wine red and deep, who laughed too loud and smiled too little. She had stood at the threshold of the dining room in the Vitali compound in Greenwich, Connecticut, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and she had looked like a candle flame dropped into the middle of a thunderstorm. Dante Vitali had noticed her the moment she walked in. He always noticed her. That was the problem. He sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, not at the head, never at the head. That seat belonged to his father, Enzo Vitali, who ruled this empire with liver-spotted hands and eyes the color of old smoke. And he watched the woman his brother had brought home with the particular kind of stillness that predators cultivate. He did not move. He did not react. He simply watched the way a man watches a fire he knows he has no business touching. She was 26. He knew because Marco had told him, the way Marco told him everything, carelessly, as an afterthought, the way you mentioned the weather. She's 26, Dante. Father's choice. Ricci family. Good blood, good name, good dowry. She's going to make the alliance official. And then Marco had clapped him on the shoulder and gone back to whatever destruction currently occupied his attention. Good blood, good name, good dowry. As if she were a parcel. Cara Ricci stood in the doorway of the Vitali dining room in her white dress. Silk, he noted, with a neckline that was modest enough to pass Enzo's approval, but cut with enough elegance to suggest she understood exactly what kind of world she was entering. And she looked around the room with dark brown eyes that were calm in a way that wasn't quite peace. It was the calm of someone who had already made their decision and was now simply living through the consequences of it. She found Marco first. Of course she did. He was hard to miss. Marco Vitali, at 32, was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. All sharp jaw and golden skin, and the kind of careless magnetism that came from a lifetime of having the world arrange itself around him. He was standing by the bar cart, a glass of scotch already in his hand at 6:15 in the evening. And when he saw her, he smiled the way he smiled at everything he wanted to possess. "Cara mia," he said, and crossed the room to take her hand, and Dante watched her face do something small and complicated, a flicker, gone in an instant, before she let Marco bring her fingers to his lips. Then she looked up, and her eyes met Dante's across the length of the table. He didn't look away. He never looked away from things that unsettled him. That was a different kind of weakness, the kind that masqueraded as strength. Neither did she. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, they looked at each other through the candlelit air of the Vitali dining room, across 16 feet of polished mahogany and decades of blood and silence. And then Enzo Vitali's voice rolled through the room like the first growl of a storm, and the moment broke, and Dante picked up his wine glass and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only safe thing left to him. That dinner lasted 3 hours. Dante spoke 12 words. He counted, after, the way he counted everything: exits, threats, expenditures, lies. 12 words in 3 hours, and none of them to her. He passed the bread. He answered his father's questions about the Ricci shipment moving through Providence. He declined dessert. He excused himself at 9 o'clock, standing without ceremony, and his father's eyes tracked him with that particular weight that Enzo Vitali reserved for his younger son. Not displeasure, exactly. More like the expression of a man examining a blade he'd sharpened himself and wondering if it had gotten too sharp. "Early night," Marco said from across the table. His voice had a slur at the edges that he was working to hide. 3 scotches and 2 glasses of wine. Dante had counted those too. "Work," Dante said. "Sempre il lavoro," Enzo murmured. "Always the work." Dante buttoned his jacket and didn't look at Cara Ricci when he walked past her chair. He didn't look at the slight tension in her shoulders, or the way she held her wine glass with both hands like something she was trying not to drop. He didn't look at the small, pale mark above her left wrist, old, nearly faded, that he'd noticed when she reached across the table for the salt. That was probably nothing, and possibly everything. He walked out of the dining room and down the marble corridor and out into the cold November air, and he stood on the stone steps of his father's compound and breathed the night in until his chest stopped doing the thing it had no business doing. She is Marco's, he told himself. He told himself that for a very long time. 3 months passed. In those 3 months, the engagement was announced at a dinner attended by 60 of the most dangerous people in the northeastern United States. The Ricci family arrived from their brownstone in Brooklyn. Cara's father, Sal Ricci, compact and watchful with a consigliere's eyes. Her mother, who had a beautiful smile and drank her wine too quickly. Her older brother, Nico, who looked at Marco Vitale with the expression of a man selling something he wasn't sure he should be selling. The ring Marco put on Cara's finger was 3 carats, a round brilliant in a platinum setting, flawless. The kind of ring that announced itself, that said, she belongs to someone who has the resources to make her disappear. Dante stood against the wall during the announcement toast and watched Cara look at the ring on her finger the way you look at something you don't yet know how to feel about. He watched her smile at Sal Ricci's toast. He watched her accept the congratulations of 40 people she didn't know. He watched her laugh at something Nico said, real laughter that changed her whole face, and he thought, there she is. That's who she actually is. And then Marco put his arm around her, and the laughter dimmed, and there was that practiced composure again, smooth and impenetrable as lacquered wood. After that night, the Vitale compound became Cara's second home. She was there 3 times a week for dinners, for meetings with Enzo's wife Lucia about the wedding, for the 1,000 quiet negotiations that come with marrying into a family like theirs. She learned the compound the way you learn a territory, which rooms were safe, which conversations required a strategic deafness, which silences were polite, and which ones were loaded. And she and Dante developed the architecture of their distance. It was careful, precise, and required constant maintenance. They were unfailingly polite. They said each other's names only when necessary. They did not seek each other out in any room. When fate placed them in the same space, the library, the kitchen at odd hours, the East Terrace that overlooked the Long Island Sound, they acknowledged each other with the economy of people who understood that more was dangerous. "Good morning," she said, the first time she found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was in a silk robe, her hair unraveled from whatever she'd slept in, clearly surprised to find anyone else there. He was in a suit already, which was unusual even for him, but he'd been up since 3 with a situation in Providence that required his particular skill set, and had only just gotten home. "Morning," he said, and moved to the other side of the kitchen island. She made coffee with the focus of someone performing surgery. He drank his standing at the window, watching the gray sound. 11 minutes passed. "Do you always get up this early?" she asked. "Some nights I don't sleep." "Oh." A pause. The sound of her spoon against her mug. "Me neither. Sometimes." He didn't ask why. He knew why. He'd heard the raised voices from Marco's wing 2 nights ago. Not words, just the shape of a confrontation, and then silence, and then the particular kind of quiet that follows something that shouldn't have happened. He'd stood in the corridor for 4 seconds with his hand on the wall and done absolutely nothing, which was the correct thing to do, and which had cost him something he couldn't quantify. "The coffee here is good," she said finally. An offering, a white flag. "Lucia orders it from a place in Rome," he said. "Has for 30 years. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she'd looked at him that first night across the dinner table. "You know a lot about this house." "I grew up in it." "So did Marco." "Yes," Dante said, and left it at that. She didn't say anything else, but when he walked past her to rinse his cup, she turned slightly on her stool, tracking the movement, and he felt her attention the way you feel sunlight through glass, warm and present, and separated from you by something transparent but definitive. He put his cup in the sink and left the kitchen without looking back. The compound had its rhythms, and Dante knew them all. He had spent 30 years learning the way this house breathed, the creak of the 3rd step on the east staircase, the hour at which his father took his evening walk in the garden regardless of weather, the way the staff moved faster on nights when Marco had been drinking, the precise angle of afternoon light that turned the library gold at 4:15 in October. He knew, therefore, when things changed. He noticed the way the kitchen staff began flinching when Marco came in after noon. He noticed the way Kara's body recalibrated when his brother entered a room, a tightening, subtle, the way a hand closes instinctively around something fragile. He noticed that she had begun wearing her sleeves longer. He noticed, and he filed the noticing away in a part of himself that he kept locked with all the other things that had no useful application. The things that would only get people killed if he took them out and looked at them. He was very good at locking things away. He was less good at forgetting they were there. The fight he overheard in March was not the first and not the worst, but it was the first time he heard her cry. He was coming up the back stairs from the garage. It was past midnight, and he'd spent the evening cleaning up after a situation in Bridgeport that had required discretion rather than firepower, which was always the messier kind. And he paused on the landing when he heard Marco's voice through the wall of the east corridor. "Don't tell me how to run my own house, Kara." "I'm not telling you anything. I'm asking you not to." "Asking me." The voice had that particular quality, controlled fury stretching thin over something uglier. "You're asking me. In my own house. My father's house." "Marco, please, you've been—" Something hit the wall. Not her. The sound was wrong for that, more like a hand or an object, but close enough to her that her voice cut off, and then the silence was the kind that rings. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet and very steady in the way that things are steady when they're held together by will rather than by any structural integrity. "All right," she said. "All right." Then a door closed. Then, after a moment, a soft, muffled sound that might have been nothing. Dante stood on the landing for 60 seconds. He counted every one of them. His right hand was around the staircase rail, and his knuckles were the color of bone, and somewhere in the machinery of his chest, something was operating at a frequency it wasn't designed for. He went to his room. He did not sleep. At 4 a.m. he was at his desk, with the Providence accounts open in front of him, and he had not processed a single number in 2 hours. He thought about the mark above her wrist. He thought about the practiced composure. He thought about the way she moved through the compound like someone navigating a space that was not quite hers and never quite safe, with a kind of wary grace that he recognized because he had spent 30 years moving through this same house with the same awareness. The difference was that he had always had the weapons. She had only herself. She made her choice, the rational part of him said. Sal Ricci offered her to this family, and she walked in wearing white, and that is the life she chose. But she had been 26, and the daughter of a man who owed Enzo Vitale $400,000, and the word choice in that context was doing a great deal of work for a very small word. He closed the accounts. He opened them again. He thought about the way she had looked at him across that first dinner table, not with the calculation he'd expected, not with the performance of charm that most people deployed in this world, but with a direct, quiet attention that asked for nothing and assumed nothing, and that had felt, in that instant, like the most honest thing anyone had brought into the Vitali dining room in years. He thought about her laugh, the real one, the one that changed her face. He thought about the coffee kitchen on Tuesday morning and the 11 minutes of silence that had felt, obscurely, like the most intimate conversation he'd had in years. Stop, he told himself. He did not stop. The breaking point, not the ultimate one, not yet, but the first crack in the architecture, came on a Wednesday afternoon in April when he found her in the library. She was sitting in the leather chair by the window, the one that caught the 4:15 light, and she was not reading the book in her lap. She was looking at the Long Island Sound with the expression of someone calculating distances, and when he pushed open the library door, she turned with that fractional flinch that she'd learned to control most of the time. When she saw it was him, something in her face shifted. Not relaxation exactly. Something more provisional than that. A reduction of a particular kind of alertness. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't know you were here." "Don't apologize. It's your library." She looked back at the window. "I can go." "You don't have to." She didn't go. He crossed to the far bookshelf and found the file he'd come for. And then he did what he should not have done, which was pause on his way out and look at her properly. She had a bruise above her cheekbone, very faint, beginning to yellow at the edges, probably 3 or 4 days old. She'd covered it with makeup, done it expertly, and in different light, you wouldn't see it at all. But the afternoon sun was coming in at that particular angle, and it caught the shadow of it. And Dante stood in the library doorway for 2 seconds longer than he should have. Her eyes came back to him. She read his face. "It was a door," she said. "I know what it was," he said. A long pause. Dante. His name in her mouth. She said it carefully, precisely, the way you say something in a language you're learning. Don't. I haven't said anything. You don't need to. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, quietly and without any inflection whatsoever, "Is there anything you need?" It was not quite a question. She heard that. "No," she said. "If there ever is, there won't be." He nodded and left the library and walked to his own office and sat at his desk and pressed his fingers against his closed eyes until the image of the bruise above her cheekbone stopped being the only thing he could see. He lasted 4 more months before everything changed. Summer came to the Vitali compound with the particular cruelty of privilege. The pool opened, the boats came out, and the violence of the household conducted itself against a backdrop of pale blue skies and expensive flowers and the scent of the Sound on warm evenings. Dante ran the Northeastern Territory from his office on the 2nd floor of the compound and from a separate townhouse in Manhattan that he maintained as his operational base. He was, at 30 years old, the most effective underboss the Vitali family had ever produced. Quieter than his father, far more efficient than his brother, with a capacity for patience and strategy that Enzo called a gift, and Marco called a character flaw. "You think too much, little brother. Sometimes you just have to act." Marco acted constantly. That was the problem. The empire was fracturing in the places Marco touched it. The Staten Island operation, which Marco had insisted on overseeing personally, was hemorrhaging money through a combination of carelessness and the particular chaos that follows a man who begins his day with cocaine and ends it with scotch and has lost the ability to distinguish between the two states. The Calabrese family in Boston was circling. 2 of Marco's captains had come to Dante separately, privately, with the particular expression of men trying to signal a problem without saying the words. Dante was managing all of it. He was always managing all of it. He was sitting in his office at 10 p.m. on a Friday in July when he heard them fighting again. He'd developed, over the past 6 months, an involuntary auditory map of the compound that was specifically calibrated to the sounds of Marco and Kara's wing. He hated this about himself. It was a weakness he'd catalogued and tried to correct, and had failed to correct. And so instead, he'd converted it into something he could rationalize as protective intelligence. Not obsession, vigilance. There was a difference. Tonight the sounds escalated faster than usual. He was out of his chair before he'd consciously decided to move. He made it to the corridor of their wing and stopped himself at the door, his hand raised to knock, and stood there while the argument went through its architecture. Rising voices, Marco's the louder and rougher, Kara's low and controlled, and then suddenly less controlled, the crack of something breaking, and then silence. Dante knocked. A long pause. "Not now," Marco said. "Marco." Dante's voice was flat. "Open the door." Another pause. Then the door swung open, and Marco stood in the frame with his shirt half untucked and his eyes glassy and a glass of scotch in his left hand and the expression of a man who was furious at being interrupted. "What?" Marco said. Dante looked at him for a moment, then past him, into the room. Kara was standing by the window, her back to them both, her arms crossed. He could see from the line of her shoulders that she was doing the work of holding herself very still. "Father wants you," Dante said. It was a lie, and Marco would know it was a lie, and that was fine. "Father's asleep," he called. Marco looked at him. Dante looked back. There was a long conversation conducted entirely in the language of their shared history, 30 years of brotherhood, of the specific power dynamics of this family, of the things neither of them would say in front of witnesses. Then Marco's mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. "Always looking out for me," he said. He turned back into the room. "We'll finish this later," he said, presumably to Kara. Then he moved past Dante into the corridor, and Dante stepped aside, and they walked together in silence toward their father's end of the house. And then Marco peeled away toward the bar in the sitting room, and Dante let him go. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went back to Kara's door, which was still open, and leaned against the frame. She hadn't moved. Still at the window, arms still crossed. The room had a broken porcelain lamp on the floor. "He didn't touch me," she said, without turning around. "I know." He could tell from the sound of the break that it had been thrown, not used. "You don't need to—" "I'm not checking on you," he said. "I was passing." A pause. "You were not passing, Dante." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't." She turned around then. Her face was composed. Her eyes were bright with something she wasn't going to let become tears, he could tell. She was exercising that particular discipline that he recognized as its own kind of strength. There was no new bruising. Good. But her hands, when she uncrossed her arms, were trembling slightly at the fingers. He didn't comment on that. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me for existing in this hallway." Something flickered across her face, something wry and unhappy and almost fond. "All right," she said. "Good night, Dante." "Good night," he said, and pushed off the doorframe and walked back to his office and sat for a long time in the dark, doing absolutely nothing, which was new for him, because Dante Vitale had always known what to do next. The Vitale family owned a nightclub in Manhattan called Nero, black, Italian, simple, which was the family's aesthetic for things they didn't want questioned. It occupied 3 floors of a building in the meatpacking district, and it was one of the most profitable, legitimate businesses in the portfolio, which was why Dante managed it personally rather than delegating. He was there on a Thursday night in August, in the management office on the 3rd floor that looked down through a plate of one-way glass onto the main floor below, going through the quarterly numbers with the club's manager, a sharp Italian-American woman named Silvana, who had been running Nero for 6 years and could have run a country with the same efficiency. He was not expecting to look up from the numbers and see Kara on the dance floor. She was with a woman he didn't recognize, late 20s, dark-haired, laughing, the kind of friend who clearly knew how to have a good time. They had a table, there were drinks, and Kara was dancing. Not the careful, composed version of herself that inhabited the Vitale compound. This was something different. She was in a black dress that fit her like a statement, her hair loose, moving with an unconscious ease that suggested she'd once loved doing this before the world had taught her to be careful. She was laughing at something her friend said, and even through the glass, 1 floor up, with the bass of the music thumping through the building's bones, Dante could see the way her whole face changed when she laughed like that. He realized he had stopped mid-sentence. Silvana followed his gaze through the glass, said nothing, which was why she had a job. "Give me a minute," Dante said. He went down. He didn't plan to approach her. He planned to simply confirm that she was there, that she was safe, and return to the office. That was a reasonable, justifiable objective. He found her at the bar, ordering water. "Dante!" She saw him at the same moment he reached her, and the performance of surprise was entirely genuine. Her eyes went wide for a fraction of a second, and then that composure came back, but slower this time, like a curtain being drawn in a hurry. "You didn't tell me you were coming here," he said. "I didn't know I had to clear my social calendar with the underboss." He blinked. It was unexpectedly sharp. And then her mouth curved, just slightly, and he realized she was testing him, and something in him responded to that in a way he should not have found interesting. "It's our club," he said. "Then I chose well." She turned back to the bar, and he stood beside her, which was a mistake, because at this proximity she was close. Close enough that when the crowd pushed against them, she leaned slightly into his space, and he could smell something warm and quiet that was probably her perfume and was definitely dangerous. "You should have a table," he said. "I have a table. A private one." He caught Silvana's eye across the bar and made a small gesture. "Dante?" Her voice was low now, under the music. "You don't have to. It's not about have to." He looked at her then, fully, which he rarely allowed himself to do at close range. Her eyes in this light were not simply brown. There were other things in them, amber and something darker, and they were doing that thing again where they looked at him without performance or calculation, just direct and honest and a little bit dangerous. "It's our club. You should be comfortable." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said, soft. Something in the word had given a little, like weight shifting. Silvana materialized with a keycard for the private mezzanine. Dante walked Kara through the crowd with his hand at the small of her back. A conductor's gesture, purely practical, not even a touch, really, just a presence to guide her through the bodies. And he was entirely aware of exactly how his hand felt in that position, and he did absolutely nothing about that awareness, which was, he was beginning to understand, all he would ever be able to do. He installed her and her friend on the mezzanine, ordered a bottle brought up, said a total of 17 words, and went back to the office. He did not go back to the window. He sat at the desk with the quarterly numbers in front of him and processed 0 of them, and at midnight he sent Silvana down to arrange a car for whenever she wanted to leave. And at 1 a.m. he watched through the window as she walked through the lobby toward the exit with her friend, and the dress caught the light in the atrium, and she tucked her hair behind her ear as she laughed at something, and he watched until she was through the door, and then he went back to the numbers. He was developing a very serious problem. September brought rain to Greenwich, days of it, the sound going gray and choppy, and the compound closing in on itself the way large old houses do in foul weather. Marco left for Staten Island on a Tuesday. Business, he said. He'd been gone for days before without announcement, and Enzo had stopped asking for explanations that were never clean anyway. Dante stayed. He found Kara in the garden on Wednesday afternoon, sitting on the covered terrace in the rain, with a cup of tea and a book she wasn't reading. He should have walked past. He had a phone call with a contact in Chicago at 3, and 100 other things, and approximately no legitimate reason to pull out the iron chair across from her and sit down. He sat down. She looked at him. "Don't you have things to do?" she said. "Constantly." She looked back at the rain. After a moment, she said, "I used to love the rain. When I was a child. My mother and I would sit on the porch of our house in Bay Ridge, and she'd tell me the names of clouds." A pause. "I've been trying to remember them. I can't anymore." He thought about that. "Cumulonimbus," he said. "Cumulus, stratus, altostratus, cirrus." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. "My mother was a botanist," he said. "She believed in the names of things. She said if you know the name of something, you're less afraid of it." "Is that true?" "No," he said, "but it's a nice thing to tell a child." She smiled at that, small, real, the kind that got to him. "What was she like?" Kara asked. "She died when I was 8. Marco was 11. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was a long time ago." He paused. "She was very quiet, very competent. She moved through this house like she understood exactly what it was and had decided to love it anyway." He stopped. He didn't talk about his mother. He didn't talk about most things. He wasn't sure why he was talking about this. She had a garden. Kara looked out at the rain-gray garden. "I can see it," she said. "Someone loved that garden." She did. A long silence, not uncomfortable, the rain drumming on the terrace roof, the gray water of the Sound just visible through the trees, 2 cups of tea. She'd poured him one without asking, he realized, and he'd taken it without comment, and that small domestic ease of it was its own category of problem. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." Did you always know what this was going to be? Your life, I mean, the business, the everything?" He considered the question. "From the time I was old enough to understand," he said. "You're born into it. You learn the language of it before you learn anything else. After a while, it's not a choice. It's just topography, the shape of the land you live on." "That's a very peaceful way to describe something that isn't." "I'm not peaceful about it," he said. "I just got bored of fighting the geography." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I thought I was doing the right thing, agreeing to this. My father—" She stopped. He waited. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It does." She looked at him. Something in her face was making a decision. "My father owed yours a great deal. I knew what a marriage to Marco Vitale would cost, and I agreed to it because I thought I could manage it. I thought I was practical enough. A small, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I was 25. You were. And now I'm 26, and I'm... She stopped again and looked at her tea. I'm managing. You are, he said carefully. She looked up at him. You're very careful with words. Always. Why? Because words in this family have weight, he said. Everything you say can be used. Everything can be leveraged. Even in a garden, in the rain. Especially then. She held his gaze for a long moment. The rain said everything neither of them was saying. Dante, she said very quietly. I know, he said. He stood up, put his cup down, and went inside. He stood in the hallway for a moment, with his hand flat against the wall, and breathed the way you breathe when you're maintaining something important. And then he went to make his phone call. And he was very professional on that phone call. And he did not think about rain or cloud names or the way she'd said, I know, without being told what she knew. He thought about it later. He thought about it for a long time. October. The situation in Staten Island had collapsed entirely. 3 of Marco's men had been arrested, the operation seized, and the Calabrese family in Boston was making what Enzo charitably called inquiries that were actually something closer to incursions. Dante had spent 2 weeks managing the fallout with the particular efficiency of a man who had been cleaning up after his brother for 20 years. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't address. He was coming up the main staircase at 11 p.m. on a Thursday when he heard it. Not voices this time, just a sound. Single, dull, the kind of sound that has weight. Then silence. Then her voice, very low. Don't. He was moving before the second word. He hit Marco's door without knocking, and it wasn't locked, and it swung open onto a scene that he catalogued in approximately 1 second with the part of his brain that processed situations rather than felt them. Marco, standing in the center of the room, still dressed from wherever he'd been, his face doing that particular thing it did when the substances had won the day, and Kara on the floor beside the bed, one hand braced against the mattress, getting up, and there was blood at her lip. Blood at her lip. The processing part of Dante's brain went very quiet. The other part woke up. Get up, he said to Marco. His voice was completely level. This was the voice he used when he was not in the business of being reasoned with. Marco turned. He had the expression of a man who has done something, but is not yet fully connected to the consequences of it. Dante, stay out of... Get up. He was already moving, putting himself between Marco and Kara. And get out of this room. Marco's eyes sharpened. Beneath the haze, something calculating moved. You don't tell me what to do in my own. Dante took Marco by the collar and moved him. It was not a violent movement in the theatrical sense. It was simply efficient, the way Dante did everything. A controlled application of force that communicated, you no longer have a choice in this matter, without requiring additional emphasis. He put Marco in the corridor, closed the door. Then he turned. Kara had gotten to her feet. She was holding a cloth from the nightstand to her lip, her other hand gripping the bedpost, and her eyes were very bright. Not with tears, not quite, with something harder than that, and also more fragile, which is the particular condition of people at the end of something. Kara, her name in his mouth. He had said it so rarely, deliberately so, and now it came out with everything he'd been withholding, packed into 2 syllables, and he saw her absorb the weight of it. I'm fine, she said. You're not. He crossed to her. Let me see. She moved the cloth. The cut was small but deep, the kind that a split lip makes, and it was already swelling. His jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral, and he looked at it with clinical attention and said, It'll need ice. I know. He went to the bathroom, ran a cloth under cold water, wrapped an ice cube in a hand towel, came back. He stood in front of her, and she let him press the cold to her lip, and neither of them said anything, and he was very close, closer than they had ever been, close enough that he could feel the slight unsteadiness of her breathing, close enough to see that her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to give way. Kara, he said again, quieter. Don't pity me, she said against the cold towel. Her eyes were still dry and still that particular bright. "I don't," he said. "Then what?" It wasn't a question. He looked at her. He let himself look, fully, without the walls, for one unguarded moment, and he said nothing. Because the honest answer to that question was not something he could say and live with the consequences of. Not yet. Not here. But she read his face. She was very good at reading silence, having lived in so much of it. She closed her eyes. "Don't," she said softly, and he understood she wasn't telling him to stop what he was feeling. She was telling him she couldn't, not now, not with her lip bleeding, not with Marco 20 feet away in the corridor. "I know," he said. He stood there until her breathing steadied. Then he stepped back. "You'll sleep in the guest wing tonight," he said. "He won't—" "I know. You'll sleep in the guest wing." He said it in the voice that didn't allow for debate. "I'll handle Marco." She opened her eyes, looked at him for a long moment, with all the complicated grammar of everything they were not saying. "All right," she said. He took her to the guest wing himself, stood at the door. She went in without looking back, and he heard the lock turn, and he stood in the corridor with his hand on the doorframe for a moment. Then he went to handle Marco. He was not gentle about it. He had a conversation with his father the next morning. It was a careful conversation, as all conversations with Enzo Vitali were careful. They said things diagonally, father and son, approaching the actual subject from angles, the way you approach a sleeping animal. Dante laid out what he had seen. He laid it out clinically, accurately, without editorial. He did not say what he wanted to say, which was, "Your firstborn son is destroying himself and everything around him, and I will not watch it happen anymore." What he said instead was, "The situation is affecting operations. The captains are losing confidence. Marco needs to be managed." Enzo was quiet for a long time. He was 71 now, slower than he'd been, the famous Vitali sharpness dimmed at the edges like a blade beginning to go soft. But the core of him was still there, still cold and assessing, still the man who would build an empire from a single numbers operation in South Brooklyn 40 years ago. "Marco is the heir," Enzo said finally. "Marco is a liability," Dante said. And then, because he had calculated that this was the moment, he hit her, father. The room was very still. His fiancée. More stillness. "She is a Ricci," Dante said. "Sal Ricci has 3 capos and a route through Providence that we need. If he finds out—" "He will not find out," Enzo said, but he said it the way men say things when they know the fact they're asserting is fragile. "Not from me," Dante said. "I can't speak to others." Enzo looked at him. The old eyes were doing what they always did, reading him, trying to find the seams of motive. "You are very concerned about the Ricci girl," Enzo said. "I am concerned about the alliance." Dante held his father's gaze, and about the family's reputation, and about what it means when the heir cannot control himself in his own house. Another silence. "I'll speak to Marco," Enzo said. It was not enough. Dante knew it was not enough. But it was what Enzo was willing to offer, and Dante was not yet positioned to demand more. He took it. Marco was subdued for 2 weeks after that. There was a particular phase he went through. Dante knew the cycle well by now, where the reality of his behavior broke through the chemical fog, and something like shame moved through him, and he became almost tender with Cara, too attentive, bringing her things, saying, "I'm sorry, cara mia," in that voice that sounded genuine because in those moments it was. She accepted it. She was very gracious about it. She had a politician's ability to receive apology, which is to say, she received it without endorsing it, with enough warmth to keep the peace, and enough reserve to maintain her own counsel. Dante watched all of this from the appropriate distances. He watched Marco hold her hand at a family dinner and refill her wine and say something that made her smile, the small one, the polite one. And he watched her eyes above that smile, and they were somewhere else entirely. And the someone else they were was the problem, because she was looking toward the window, but the window was in his direction. He looked away. He had managed himself well for 10 months. He could manage himself indefinitely. He had excellent discipline. He had spent 30 years being the person this family required, which meant setting aside everything inconvenient, including himself, and he was good at it. He was very, very good at it. And then one evening in November, she came to his office. She knocked, waited for his answer, came in when he opened the door to find her in the corridor with a book under her arm and the expression of someone who had thought very carefully before arriving here and was still not certain she'd made the right decision. "I wanted to return this," she said, holding out the book. "I borrowed it from the library." He looked at the book. Leopardi, Canti. He hadn't lent it to her. She'd taken it from the shelf herself, apparently. "You read Italian?" he said. "I studied it in college," she said. I needed something to do with my evenings." He took the book. Their fingers did not quite touch. "Did you like it?" he said. "He's very sad. All the great ones are." She looked at him. Something behind her eyes was asking a question that had nothing to do with 19th century Italian lyric poetry. "Come in," he said, "if you want." She came in. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and he sat behind it, and they talked about Leopardi for an hour, and then about other things, books, The Sound in Winter, The City, a film she'd seen with her friend before everything had changed. And it was the most he had talked to another person voluntarily in years, and it was effortless in a way that nothing effortless was without cost. When she left, at 9:30, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for this." "It's just conversation," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why." The first time he kissed her was not planned. It was December, 11 days before Christmas, and the compound was dressed for the holidays in the Vitale manner, which is to say, with the particular ostentation of people who have always had money and understand that the display of it is political. And there was a Christmas party in the ballroom for the family's inner circle, 40 people, good wine, a string quartet. Marco had been gone for 3 days, a situation in New Jersey that Dante had deliberately declined to manage because Marco needed to manage something himself or the captains would stop pretending they respected him, which would create a different kind of problem. He was in the library. The party was going without him, which was fine. He'd made an appearance, shaken hands, exchanged the necessary words, and then extracted himself to the library at 9 p.m. because he had reading to do and because crowds of his family's associates reminded him of obligations he was currently struggling to fulfill. She found him at 10. She came in quietly, with a glass of wine, and shut the door behind her, and when he looked up from the desk, she had an expression that was both determined and unhappy, which he was beginning to understand was one of her natural states. "The party is very loud," she said. "It is." She sat, not at the chair across from the desk. She'd started using the chair near the window, the one that caught the 4:15 light, which had become, by some unspoken agreement, her chair. He did not think about what it meant that she had a chair in his office. They sat for an hour. She read, he read. The string quartet was audible in the distance, and occasionally voices from the party. And it was comfortable. It was the most dangerous kind of comfortable, the kind that makes you forget to be cautious. At 11, she said, "I found out something today." Something in her voice. "Tell me," he said. "Marco has been... There's someone in Staten Island." She said it evenly. She was very good at even. "A woman. I think it's been going on for some time." A pause. "I found a receipt. In his jacket. I wasn't snooping. I was taking it to the cleaners, and..." She stopped. "Kara, I don't care about the faithfulness," she said quickly. "That's not what... I mean, this marriage was never... I don't care about that part. I care because it means he's been lying to me on top of everything else. And I care because..." Her voice wavered, the first real waver he'd heard in months, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly and got it back. "I care because I have been trying so hard. I have been trying to manage this and be adequate to what this family requires of me, and I have been taking it, all of it, and he is..." She stopped again. He had moved without knowing he was moving. He was standing in front of her chair now, and she looked up at him, and her eyes were finally finally bright with the tears she'd been refusing for 11 months, and she said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't." "Don't apologize," he said. "This isn't your... Kara." He crouched down so they were at eye level, which brought him very close, and he put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. And she looked at his hand, and then at his face, and neither of them breathed. "Dante," she said. He should have stood up. He should have said something careful and appropriate and walked to the other side of the room. Instead, he said her name back to her, just her name, the way he'd been saying it in his head for a year, with all of it unlocked. And she leaned forward, and so did he, and it was the softest thing in the world at first. Just her mouth, just his, just the quietest possible collision, careful and inevitable, like two things that have been moving toward each other for a very long time, finally arriving. Then she made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a sigh, and his hand moved to her face, and the careful part dissolved, and there was only this. He pulled back first, because he was always the one who pulled back. They looked at each other from 2 inches apart. Her eyes were searching his face for something, and he didn't know what she found there because he'd stopped managing his expression entirely. "We can't," she said. "I know," he said. "Dante, I know." He pressed his forehead briefly to hers. Then he stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands in his pockets and breathed. "This can't happen again," she said. "No," he agreed. "I mean it." "So do I." A silence. "God," she said quietly, with something almost like a laugh in it. "What a mess." He turned around. She was sitting in her chair with her wineglass in both hands and her eyes still too bright, and she was looking at him with an expression he would think about for a very long time afterward. "Yes," he said. It happened again 4 days later, January. They were careful. They were very, very careful, which meant they were very careful and then occasionally not careful at all, and the careful parts were almost worse because they required the constant maintenance of a performance that was wearing them both thin. It was a library thing, mostly, at first. Late evenings, when Marco was in Staten Island or Manhattan or wherever Marco went when he left destruction behind him at home. She would come to his office, or he would go to the library, and they would talk until midnight or later. Talk in the way that two people talk when they have been starving for exactly this kind of conversation. Not about the family, not about the life, but about the world outside it. Books, music, the places she'd studied, the places he'd seen through the glass of this world. European cities where he'd gone for operations and had an hour in the afternoon to be no one in particular, to sit in a cafe and be a person without context. "You should have been something else," she said to him once, in the small hours of a January night, with the lamp low and snow beginning outside. "Everyone should have been something else," he said. "No, most people are what they were made to be. You're something you made yourself, and you used the materials you had, but the design was always yours." She looked at him steadily. "What would you have been?" He thought about it, actually thought about it, which he rarely did. Indulging the hypothetical was a luxury that the functional parts of his mind had never had time for. "I don't know," he said. "Something quiet, something where the outcome was clear. Architecture, maybe." "Architecture," she repeated and smiled. "You find that funny." "Not funny, perfect. You build things. You shore things up. You hold the walls in place." Her smile faded into something more serious. "That's what you do for this family." "That's what I do." "Is it enough?" she asked. "For you, is it enough?" He looked at her. "There are things that would be more," he said carefully, "but they aren't available to me." She held his gaze. "Some of them might be," she said, very quietly, very deliberately. This was what they did. They spoke in implication, in the narrow lane between what they were allowed to say and what they needed to mean. It was its own language. He had not spoken it with anyone before. He crossed to her chair and tilted her face up and kissed her with everything he was careful about in a way that he was not careful at all. And she kissed him back with everything she'd been managing. And it was the most honest thing he'd done in 30 years. The affair was this: her hand in his, briefly, in the dark of the compound hallway when no one was watching. His jacket around her shoulders in the garden when she'd come out without one. An hour in the library becoming 2, becoming the whole night, talking and then not talking, both of them intensely aware that what they were building was something that existed entirely in the spaces between other things. He had never been in love before. He had not had the time or the space for it, and he had understood early that love in this world was a vulnerability that could be targeted. So he had managed it out of himself, with the same efficiency with which he managed everything else. What he felt for Kara Ricci was not manageable. He had tried. He had tried for a year and 2 months and roughly 15 days, and he had produced nothing but a series of increasingly sophisticated methods of not addressing the fact that she had taken up residence in every calculation he made, every risk assessment, every decision. She was the variable he couldn't isolate. She was the one thing he could not be dispassionate about. And Dante Vitali had been dispassionate about everything, including his own life, for as long as he could remember. She had changed the architecture. For her part, she was, he watched her become, over those winter months, a version of herself that he thought might be the real one. Not the composed, careful woman the Vitali household required, but the person underneath that, quick and wry and deeply, uncomplicatedly intelligent, with opinions she'd learned to edit and feelings she'd learned to manage, and a capacity for warmth that the household had been slowly attempting to extinguish. She wasn't recovered. She was too clear-eyed to pretend that the situation she was in was anything other than what it was. But in the spaces they made together, she was present, alive in the way that people are when they're finally seen. "You look at me differently than everyone else," she said one night. "How do I look at you?" "Like you're not making any demands," she said. "Like you're just looking." "I am," he said. "Just looking." She turned to face him. "What do you see?" He was quiet for a moment. "Everything," he said. "That's the problem." February brought Marco home with a dangerous energy that Dante recognized as escalation. The drugs had progressed, not to a new substance, but to a new quantity, a new reliance, the kind that rewrites personality rather than merely blurring it. Marco, at his best, had always been charismatic and volatile, the family's bright, burning front face. Marco now was something darker, more erratic, the charm becoming intermittent, the volatility becoming a constant. He came home from Staten Island with 3 days of paranoia on him like a second skin. He was convinced that his captains were skimming. He was convinced the Calabrese family had an inside man. He was convinced that Dante was managing him. 2 of those 3 things were true in various degrees. He called a meeting of the captains in the compound's basement. The war room, they called it, because Enzo had called it that, though actual warfare had not been conducted in it for 15 years. Dante sat at the table and watched his brother pace the length of the room and make accusations that had about 60% accuracy, which was almost more dangerous than being entirely wrong, because the 40% error rate was targeting the wrong men. "You need evidence before you move," Dante said. "I have evidence. You have suspicion." Marco turned on him. "Don't tell me the difference between evidence and suspicion, Dante. I've been running this operation since before." "You haven't been running it," Dante said, quietly. "I have." The room went very still. Marco looked at him. Something in his brother's eyes was working through the drugs to register what had just been said. "What did you—" "For 2 years," Dante said, his voice even. "I have managed the Staten Island operation, the Providence route, the Boston negotiations, the alliance with the Riccis, and the internal administration of this family. You have been present, intermittently." One of the captains made a small sound that he quickly suppressed. Marco moved toward him, and Dante did not move, and they looked at each other in the way they had been looking at each other their entire lives, the older and the younger, the heir and the spare, and what was between them was everything it had always been, and also something new, the particular tension of a transfer of power that neither of them had named yet. "After the meeting," Marco said. "After the meeting," Dante agreed. The after-the-meeting conversation took place in Marco's office, and involved volume, and at one point, Marco throwing a glass that broke against the wall 6 inches from Dante's head, and Dante standing still through all of it, with the expression of a man waiting for a storm to pass. And at the end of it, Marco said, "Stay out of my territory, and stay away from my fiancée." Dante looked at him for a long moment. "Get sober," Dante said. "Then we'll talk about whose territory is whose." He walked out. He went directly to his office and sent a text to Kara. "Stay in your wing tonight." And after a moment, "Stay in your wing tomorrow." She responded, "What happened?" "Nothing yet," he typed back. "I'll explain." He sat at his desk and looked at the window and thought about the shape of what was coming. He was very good at reading trajectories. He had been watching Marcos for 2 years, and he knew, with the clarity that comes from having cleaned up after someone long enough to understand their patterns, where this one ended. The question was, what happened after? He had a plan for after. It was a plan he'd constructed over 2 years, assembled piece by piece with the patience of a man who understood that timing was everything in this kind of operation. He had the captain's loyalty, not through coercion, but through competence, through being present and reliable and correct when Marco was none of those things. He had his father's tacit recognition, which Enzo had never stated openly but had communicated in 100 small ways. The problems he brought to Dante instead of Marco, the conversations conducted out of Marco's presence. He had the relationships with the allied families. What he hadn't planned was that the plan now had a face, and the face had dark brown eyes with amber in them, and he could not look at it without the machinery of his chest doing the thing that it had no business doing. He thought about what it would mean to claim both things at once, the throne and her. The sheer audacity of it in the moral world of this family, the blood it would require. He thought about her lip cut against the cut, bleeding, and her voice saying, "Don't," and his brother's hand as the instrument. He thought, "Let it burn." March. They stole an evening. It was the first time they had been fully alone, off the compound, without the building's walls as both sanctuary and witness. He drove her to the city in his car, just the two of them, on the pretext of a dinner with her friend, which existed. He dropped her at the restaurant, waited 2 hours in the bar 2 blocks away, and when she came out, she got back in the car and he drove them to the townhouse in Manhattan. He'd thought about it a great deal before offering it. He'd thought about the risks, the exposure, the staff, the dozen ways this could go wrong. He'd thought about what it meant to do this, in the real world, rather than in library spaces and stolen hallways. He'd thought about all of that, and had picked up the phone and told her quietly, in 17 words, what the option was. She'd said, yes, just that. The townhouse was spare, minimal, the opposite of the compound's heavy grandeur. He owned it outright, in a name that wasn't his, and it functioned as a workspace and occasionally a place to breathe. There was nothing decorative in it except a single painting in the living room, a landscape, gray and quiet, the Italian coast in winter. She stood in front of it for a long time. "Amalfi," she said, "south of it, a village. I drove through it once. I had an hour before a meeting and I went down to the water. I bought the painting from a man who was selling them out of his boot." She turned around. She was in that same state of quiet aliveness she got sometimes, the version of her that wasn't managing anything, and she looked at him across the room. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I know what I am to you." She said it with a directness that cost her something. He could see that. "And I know what this is, and what it can't be. And I am not a woman who does things halfway, Dante. I don't make these choices lightly. So I need you to know that I'm here because She stopped. "Because it's you. Not because it's a way out or an escape or because I'm—" He crossed the room. "I know," he said. "I know exactly why you're here." "Do you?" "Because it's also me," he said. "Because I've been trying not to be here since the day I met you, and the fact that I'm here anyway is the most significant thing I've done in my entire life." She looked at him with those eyes that didn't perform and didn't calculate, and that saw him in a way no one else in his life had ever bothered to, and she said, "Then stop trying not to be here." And he did. They had hours. They used them the way you use something you know is temporary, fully, with the awareness of its edges, which is the only way to be fully inside something. He learned her the way he learned things, slowly and completely, and she let herself be learned, and she learned him, and they talked after, in the dark, in the narrow hours before he had to drive her back, tangled together in the spare room he'd never shared with anyone. "What happens?" she said at 2 a.m., not as a question, into the dark. "I'm working on it," he said. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. He was quiet for a moment. The situation is, don't manage this one, she said. Don't manage me, just tell me. He thought about it. Marco is going to destroy himself, he said. He's been on that trajectory for 2 years, and it's approaching a point I can't moderate. When that happens, the family needs to continue. The empire needs to continue. He stopped. I've been building toward that, deliberately, because it was the right thing for the organization, and because... He stopped again. Because, she said, because the idea of you staying in that house, in that position, for the rest of your life, he said it flatly, the way he said hard things, was not something I could... Dante, I know it's complicated. It's not complicated, she said. It's terrifying. Yes. She was quiet. I'm patient, he said. I'm very patient. I know, she pressed closer. I know you are. I need you to be patient too. I am, she said. I've been patient my whole life. April, and the empire shook. It began with the Boston situation, which had been festering since January. The Calabrese family had made a move on the Providence route, and Marco, rather than handling it with the measured response the situation required, had sent 3 men to send a message that was approximately 4 degrees too loud, which brought attention from federal authorities who had been watching the Providence corridor with interest for 18 months. Dante spent 2 weeks managing the federal interest out of existence through lawyers and legitimate business filings and a conversation with a contact in Providence that required him to be very clear about certain things in a room that was very quiet. He managed it. The corridor survived. 2 of Marco's men did not, which was a different and acceptable cost. But the damage to Marco's credibility was done. Enzo called them both to his study on a Wednesday morning. He was sitting behind his desk, smaller than he'd seemed 5 years ago, the empire's weight having consolidated in the bones, and he looked at his 2 sons with the expression of a man doing an accounting. The captains want a meeting, Enzo said. Marco said, then we have a meeting. Enzo said, they want to meet with Dante. The silence that followed had the density of something falling. Marco turned to look at Dante, and Dante met his brother's eyes and did not look away and did not apologize and felt the full weight of what this moment was. Enzo, Marco said. His voice was very careful. I am your heir. You are my son, Enzo said, which was different. Which Marco heard. You're doing this because of her, Marco said, and the her was directed at Dante with a precision that meant he knew more than he had shown. Aren't you? I'm doing this because of Providence, Enzo said quietly, because of Staten Island, because of the last 2 years. Marco laughed. It was a terrible sound, short and bright and wrong. He stood up and straightened his jacket and said, we'll see, and walked out of his father's study. Dante sat in the study for a moment after. He knows about her, Dante said. I suspected, Enzo said. How long? Long enough. Enzo looked at him with those old smoke eyes. What are your intentions? To manage the situation, Dante said. That is not what I asked. A pause. She should not be with Marco, Dante said. She should not have been with him from the beginning. You know that. What I know and what the law of this family requires are not always the same thing, Enzo said. No, Dante said. They're not. Another pause. There will be a meeting, Enzo said finally, with the captains, in May. He looked down at his desk. I am not as young as I was. It was the closest his father had ever come to abdication. I'll be ready, Dante said. He left the study and went directly to his office and composed, in his head, the next 16 moves. He was an excellent chess player, had been since childhood, when the particular pleasure of long, patient strategy had appealed to him far more than the brutality of the short game. He could see the board clearly from here. He could see where each piece needed to be. The part of the board that concerned him was Marco. Marco was unpredictable, in a way that his plans could not fully account for. He had always been, which is why Dante spent so much time cleaning up after him. But unpredictability in a cornered man was a different quality from unpredictability in a man with power. A cornered Marco was a dangerous Marco. He sent a message to Kara. Be careful this week. Her response came in 2 minutes. Always am. What's happening? Moving pieces, he wrote. Be careful too, she wrote. And then, after a pause, please. He held his phone for a moment. Always am, he sent back. The night of May 3rd, 3 things happened. The first, the meeting with the captains, which had been arranged with the care and precision of a surgical operation. Dante met with 7 men, the most senior, the most influential, the ones whose loyalty determined the rest, in the conference room of a restaurant in Westport that the family owned, and he laid out a transition framework with the clinical efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this for 2 years. He presented numbers, outcomes, solutions. He presented the Boston Resolution, the Providence Survival, the Alliance Maintenance. He presented, in other words, what competence looks like when it's been running things quietly for long enough that people have confused it with the furniture. The captains listened. They asked questions. They were, all 7 of them, already on this side of the equation and had been for some time. The meeting was a formality that was also a coronation. Dante understood the difference and treated it accordingly. He was home by 11. The second thing, his father, who had been failing more visibly in the past weeks than Dante had allowed himself to fully register, collapsed in his study at 9 p.m. and was taken to Greenwich Hospital. Not a heart attack, a minor stroke, the doctors said, the first of what would likely be several. He was stable. He was 68 hours from likely being sent home with a medication regimen and instructions to rest. But the throne had just become empty. The third thing was Marco. Dante heard it as he came through the compound's main entrance at 11:15. Voices, loud, and something breaking, and then a scream that he would hear in whatever passed for his dreams for a very long time afterward. He ran. He went through the east corridor and hit the door of Marco's suite so hard it came off one hinge, and the scene inside was wrong. Everything was wrong. The room had been destroyed, furniture overturned, glass everywhere, and Marco was standing in the center of it with his hands shaking and his eyes all the way gone, whatever had been left of his reason dissolved in whatever he'd been taking, and Kara was... She was on the floor by the window. Dante crossed the room. He put himself between her and Marco before he had any memory of deciding to do so, and he said, in a voice he kept absolutely flat, "Marco, stop." She was going to leave. Marco's voice was strange, high and jagged. She was going to go to my father. She thinks I don't know, Dante. She thinks I don't know about... Stop, Dante said. About you. About what you... Stop. The word came out like a verdict. Marco stopped. Something in the authority of it, in the way Dante was standing, in the accumulated weight of what their relationship actually was versus what their birth order suggested it should be. Something made Marco stop. Dante did not turn around. He spoke to the room. "Tony," he said. His man was at the door. He'd called him from the car. "Take Ms. Ricci to the guest wing. Get the doctor." He heard movement behind him, heard Kara's voice, low, saying she was all right. She could walk. He did not turn around until the door was closed and they were alone, the 2 of them, in the wreckage of the room. Then he looked at his brother. "Sit down," he said. "Dante, sit down." Marco sat. Dante sat across from him. He looked at his brother, really looked for a long time at the wreck of what he'd been. The gold and the beauty and the careless magnetism all burned down to something raw and unstable and frightened. He thought about 11 years old and 24 and 30 years of being the one who came after, who held the pieces together, who built the walls while Marco burned through them. He thought about what comes after the burning. "It's over," Dante said. Marco looked at him. "You can't..." "The captains met tonight," Dante said. "Father is in the hospital. What happens next is what you already know is going to happen." He paused. "This is the last thing you do to her. Do you understand me?" Marco looked at him with the eyes of a man who sees the end of something and doesn't know yet whether to rage against it or collapse. "You love her," Marco said, quiet now, hollow. "Yes," Dante said. It was the first time he had said it to anyone. He said it the way he said true things, without drama, without apology. Marco looked at him for a long moment. "You always..." he started. "Yes," Dante said again. "I know." 6 weeks later, Marco Vitali drove his car off a bridge on Route 1 in Greenwich at 2:30 in the morning. The police report noted a high blood alcohol level and a foggy night. The internal family assessment, conducted by Dante, noted that Marco had been increasingly erratic in the weeks following the scene in his suite, that he had left the compound on the night in question without informing anyone, that the particular bridge had no guardrail damage consistent with foul play, that 3 people could account for Marco's state that evening, and all 3 reported he had been drinking since mid-afternoon. The funeral was a Vitale affair, which meant large and dark and precise in its rituals. The church in Greenwich filled with 100 people who had known Marco in various capacities, many of whom were in various capacities also relieved. Grief in this world was complicated. People cried for what had been instead of what was. Enzo wept. Dante stood beside his father in the pew and held himself very still, which was what he did when he was feeling too much and had nowhere to put it. He grieved his brother. He grieved the person Marco had been at 11 years old, quick and funny and bright, before the family had begun the process of making him into what it needed him to be, before the pressure of the heir's position had met the particular fragility of Marco's nature, before the substances had found the cracks. He grieved the version of Marco that might have existed in a different story. He did not grieve the man who had put his hands on Cara Ricci. He stood at the graveside in the cold June rain and watched the casket go into the ground and was honest with himself about both things, which was, he thought, the most he could offer. Cara stood 20 feet away on the other side of the grave. She was in black, correct in all the ways the occasion demanded, and she kept her eyes on the ground during most of the service. Once she looked up and found him looking at her, and they held each other's gaze across the open grave for 3 seconds before both of them looked away. 3 days after the funeral, she moved back to the Ricci brownstone in Brooklyn. This was expected and correct, and Dante had anticipated it and had said nothing about it, because the timing required silence and patience, and he had both. He called her, once, on the 4th day. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Working on it." A pause. "Dante," she said, very quiet. "I know," he said. "Give it time." "How much time?" "The right amount," he paused. "I'm going to do this right. The meeting is in 2 weeks." "The meeting," she repeated. "The captains, the official, yes." He didn't say the word succession, but they both heard it. "And then I come for you," he said, simply, as a fact, "if you want that." The pause before she answered was the longest pause of his life. "Yes," she said, "I want that." "Then I'll come," he said. The meeting of June 22nd was not dramatic. That was the thing about real power, Dante had always observed. It didn't require theater. Theater was for people who needed to convince others of something they didn't fully believe themselves. Real authority was simply there, like gravity, and people moved around it the way they moved around anything you couldn't argue with. He sat at the head of the Vitali table for the first time. His father was there, recovering, diminished but present, his presence a symbol and a blessing rather than a governance. Enzo had dressed with his old precision and his old dignity, and he looked at his younger son at the head of the table and said nothing, and his silence had the particular weight of a man who has done the accounting and found it correct. The 7 captains were there, the consigliere, the family's legal representative, the liaison to the allied families. Dante spoke for 40 minutes. He was specific, unambiguous, and calm. He outlined the new operational structure, the resolution of the Boston situation, the terms of the Ricci alliance going forward. He addressed the question of succession. He addressed the question of the family's position in the current landscape. He answered questions. When it was over, the consigliere, a 70-year-old man named Carmine, who had seen 4 dawns, who had no sentiment for anyone, looked at Dante and said, "The family is in good hands." It was the ceremony. He was the dawn. He drove to Brooklyn 3 days later. He came alone. No security, no announcement, no convoy. He drove himself in a black sedan, and he parked on the street in front of the Ricci brownstone in Bay Ridge, which was a quiet street with plane trees just coming into leaf. And he sat in the car for a moment, looking at the building. Then he went up the steps and rang the bell. Sal Ricci opened the door. They looked at each other. Sal Ricci was a man of 60 who had made his accommodations with the world and knew the shape of every deal. He looked at Dante Vitale on his front steps, not as the younger brother, not as the underboss, but as the Don, and he made his calculation with the speed and accuracy of a man who had survived this long by being fast with calculations. "Dante," Sal said. "Sal," Dante said, "I'd like to speak to Kara." Another calculation. Then Sal stepped back from the door. Kara was in the sitting room. She was standing when he came in, which meant she'd known he was coming, had heard his voice, or his footstep, or simply the particular quality of the air that changes when something significant arrives. She was in something pale, simple, her hair back, and she looked at him the way she'd been looking at him from the beginning, directly, without performance, with all of herself available and none of it easy. Her father was not in the room, which meant something. "Don Vitale," she said, not mocking, just acknowledging. "Not with you," he said, "never with you." She pressed her lips together briefly. "Dante." "I told you I'd come," he said. He crossed the room toward her, slowly, giving her every opportunity to hold her ground or step back. She held her ground. He stopped in front of her. "I told you I'd come for you, if you still want that." "I still want that," she said. "It's not simple," he said. "It's never going to be simple. There are people who know, who will always know what the order of events was. There are people who will count the months. There are people in this world who will—" "I know," she said. "You'd be the Don's woman," he said. "After being the heir's fiancée, they'll say things. Let them." He looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. "I've been sure," she said, "since the night I found you in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, and you told me that knowing the name of something makes you less afraid of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know what this is. I know your name. I'm not afraid." He put his hand against her face, the way he had in the library the first night, cupping her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone. "Kara," he said. And then he kissed her, in the Bay Ridge sitting room, with the plane trees outside, and her father in the next room, and the weight of everything they'd done, and everything they'd paid, and everything they were walking into, pressing down on both of them. And she kissed him back, with the full force of someone who has made their decision and does not have another one to make. She came to the compound in July, not as a guest, not as a fiancée, not as someone the family had acquired through negotiation and debt. She came as Dante's, which was a different thing entirely, which the household understood, in the way households understand these shifts, through the language of arrangement and attention, which room was given her, where her place was set at table, the way the staff moved differently around her. Enzo received her in his study. He had aged significantly in the past months. The stroke had taken something from him, some structural element of his manner, and he seemed, for the first time in Dante's memory, like an old man rather than a patriarch. He sat behind his desk and looked at Kara Ricci standing in front of it, and was quiet for a moment. "You are aware," he said, "of what people will say." "Yes," Kara said, "and it doesn't concern you." "What concerns me," Kara said carefully, "is being exactly who I am and where I should be. Everything else is talk." Enzo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dante, and there was something in his face, complicated, worn, almost, but not quite, like peace. "She's right for you," Enzo said. Not to her, to Dante. "I know," Dante said. The summer was theirs. It was the first summer Dante could remember in which the machinery of his life had aligned. Not perfectly, not without complication, but in the direction he had pointed it, and the direction was forward, and not upward, not maintaining some architecture that had never been structurally sound. He was the Don. The weight of that was not small. The captains came to him now with everything, and everything meant exactly that. The financial reports, the territorial questions, the diplomatic negotiations with 3 families in 2 cities, the constant management of the outer edges of an empire that required every strategic resource he had. He was good at it. He had always been good at it, but he was also, for the first time, doing it as himself rather than as the mechanism behind his brother. He had a different quality in meetings now. People who had always respected him found something new in him. Not a change in character, but a permission, an unlocking. He was the same Dante, as economical and precise as ever, but there was something less managed about him, some quality that had previously been held in reserve that now sat at the surface. The captains called it authority. Dante thought it was more like simply being present. He brought Kara to Nero on a Thursday in August, his club, their club now, in whatever implicit way things become shared. And they sat in the private mezzanine with the city below them, and good wine, and the music coming up through the floor. And she wore something red, the first time he'd seen her in red, and the effect of it was considerable. "You're staring," she said. "I am. You usually don't." "I usually have to be more careful," he said. She smiled, the real one. "You don't have to be careful anymore." "I'm always careful." He reached across the table and took her hand, which was something he'd done in private for months, but which, here, in the club, where someone from any allied family could walk through the door, was different, was a statement. She felt the difference. Her eyes went to his. "Dante," she said. "I know," he said, "but this is the world we're in. Better for it to be clear." She looked at him for a moment. Then her fingers curled around his. "All right," she said. They stayed until midnight. They were seen by 3 people whose families would know by morning. Dante took her home to the compound with his hand on the small of her back, and the night was warm, and the sound was black silk, and he stood on the stone steps of his father's house, his house now, and felt the weight and the length of what it had taken to get here. She stopped beside him. "What are you thinking?" she said. "About cost," he said. "About the things that had to break." She was quiet. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Not Marco. She didn't say his name. But the meaning was clear. "No," he said, honestly. "Neither do I," she said. "God help me. Neither do I." He put his arm around her, and they stood in the summer dark until the cool came off the water. And then he took her inside, into his house, which was learning to be theirs. September brought complications of the human variety, because the world does not stop having opinions simply because you have stopped asking for them. There was a dinner, a formal one, the kind the Vitali family held twice a year for allied families, and Kara came to it as Dante's, the first such public occasion. Dante had thought carefully about staging, her seat at the table, her introduction, the language he used. He had prepared for every foreseeable reaction. He had not prepared for Sal Ricci. Sal arrived at the dinner looking older than he had in July, and he arrived with his wife and Nico, and they sat at the table with the precision of people executing a decision they'd made in advance. When the seating placed Sal next to Dante, Sal leaned over and said, very quietly, into the space of a conversation that the table's noise kept private, "My daughter is happy." Dante looked at him. "I see it," Sal said. "I saw it in July. I want you to know I understand what happened. Not all of it, but enough." He paused. Marco was not right for her. He was never right for her, and Something moved through his face. "I knew that, before. I knew that, and Sal," Dante said quietly. "I made a decision that hurt her," Sal said. "I'm trying to say that I see what's here now, and it is what should have been." Dante looked at the man for a moment. He thought about $400,000 and a girl in a white dress and 11 months of watching something break. "She forgave you," Dante said. It was not a question. "She's better than I am," Sal said. "Yes," Dante agreed. "She is." Sal looked at him, surprised by the agreement, and then something in him relaxed, the particular release of a man who has been carrying something and has finally found somewhere to set it down. Later in the evening, Dante found himself in a corner conversation with Carmine, the consigliere, who was on his second Amaro and in his truth-telling phase. "They're talking," Carmine said. "I know," Dante said. "Some of them think. I know what they think." Carmine looked at him over the rim of his glass. "Does it matter to you?" Dante looked across the room to where Kara was talking with Nico, her head tilted in the way it tilted when she was fully engaged in something, her hands moving slightly, the way they did when she was making a point. She looked settled, present, like someone who had finally arrived somewhere. "No," Dante said. "Good," said Carmine. "Doubt is expensive." "I haven't doubted this since before I knew what it was," Dante said. Carmine made a sound that was half a laugh. You know, in 30 years of watching people in this world make decisions about women, he paused, in the manner of a man deciding how far to take a thought. Most of them think about it too much or not at all. You're the first one I've seen who seems to have thought about exactly the right amount. Is that a compliment, Carmine? It's an observation. He finished his Amaro. She's good for the family, too. Clear head, good instincts, knows when to be visible and when to disappear. That's worth more than any alliance. Dante looked at him. Don't tell her I said that, Carmine said. I have a reputation to maintain. Dante found her later in the evening, in a brief space between conversations, and told her what Carmine had said, and watched her eyes do the thing they did. High praise, she said. Highest from Carmine. She was quiet for a moment. Are they accepting it? All of them? The ones who matter, he said. The ones who don't matter. You say that very easily. I believe it, he said. That makes it easier. She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her face, something settled and warm, and still a little raw around the edges, the way things are when they're real rather than performed. Dante, she said. I know, he said. You always say that. Because I always do, he said. She smiled. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that her smile, the real one, the one that changed her whole face, was the one thing in his life that he had never been able to manage, and had stopped trying to. October came back around, the anniversary of nothing and everything. He woke before her, as he always did. The room was gray with early light. They were at the townhouse in Manhattan, a weekend, an indulgence he'd begun allowing himself with the specific intention of having more of them, and she was asleep with the particular abandon of someone who finally felt safe enough to sleep without listening. He lay still for a long time. He thought about a year ago, October a year ago, the library, rain, cloud names, the first real conversation, the terrible, careful architecture of their distance. He thought about how long a year can be when you're measuring it in a particular kind of pain. He thought about the months after that, the slow dismantling, the accumulation of all those late library nights and stolen hours and mornings in the kitchen and the single evening in this room when they'd first been honest enough to use it properly. He thought about December and the first kiss, which had tasted like terror and relief in equal measure. He thought about everything that had broken since then, his brother, the arrangement, the old order of things, and the way the breaking had felt necessary and wrong and inevitable all at once. There was no clean version of this story. He had known that from the beginning, and he had chosen it anyway, and he could not and would not revise that choice, because revision was for people who didn't understand what they'd decided. She made a sound, something soft and unconscious, and turned toward him in her sleep, and he felt the warmth of her and the weight of her, and thought, this is the thing I would let the empire burn for. He had said that to himself before, as an abstraction, as a measure of something. Now it was simply true. Not dramatic, not rhetorical, just the most accurate sentence he knew. She opened her eyes. She looked at him in the way you look at someone first thing, unguarded, direct, morning reel. Hi, she said. Good morning, he said. She studied his face in the gray light. You've been awake for a while. An hour. Thinking about what? You. Her mouth curved, just slightly. That's either very romantic or very alarming. Both, he said. Always both. She reached up and put her hand against his face, her palm to his jaw, the way he put his hand to her face, their particular mirror gesture, the one they developed without planning it. He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. She watched him do it. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me. When I came to this family, she said slowly, she paused. I was performing survival. I was managing. Every day was a set of calculations. How to be small enough not to be a problem. How to be correct enough not to be a target. And another pause. I was disappearing. Very slowly, very politely. I was becoming a version of myself that was all edges, all management. No, there was nothing left over for anything else. He was very still. And then, she said, there was you, in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, telling me the names of clouds because your mother said it made things less frightening. She looked at him steadily. You gave me back the idea that I could be someone who existed rather than just functioned. Do you understand that? Yes, he said. I want you to know that, she said. Whatever else, whatever the world thinks about this, or what it means, or how it happened, I want you to know that you saw me, when I'd become very hard to see, and that... Her voice was very even, very deliberate. That is not a small thing. He looked at her for a long time. You have always been very easy to see, he said. The difficulty was looking away. She kissed him then. She initiated it, which she did with increasing confidence, and he felt the difference between the first kiss in the library and this one, felt all the months between them like a chord in it, everything they'd been to each other, layered in the simple fact of being here. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. What's today? She said. Sunday. Good, she settled back. I don't want to be anywhere else today. Then we won't be, he said. They weren't. They had coffee at the table by the window, and the light came across the rooftops of the city, and she had her feet pulled up on the chair and was reading something, and he was doing absolutely nothing, which was new for him, which he was learning to do, and the quiet was the kind of quiet that doesn't require filling. At some point, she looked up and found him watching her, and said, You're doing it again. I know, he said. I've decided I like it, she said, and went back to her book. He thought about his mother saying that knowing the name of a thing makes you less afraid of it. Love, he thought. The name of it is love. He wasn't afraid. December again, and the anniversary of the first kiss, which only one of them was counting, but both of them knew. Nero was closed that Thursday, a private event, which was to say Silvana had been told to empty the calendar, and had done so with the efficiency of someone who understood that the Don's personal calendar was not a negotiating position. The club was lit low, the string quartet that played the family events engaged for the evening, and there were exactly 2 of them at a table on the mezzanine with a bottle of something excellent between them. He had asked her something 3 days ago. She had said yes. The ring was not the 3-carat statement of possession that Marco had put on her finger 14 months before. It was a narrow band with a single emerald, deep green, the color of the Italian coast in her favorite painting, set in old gold. He had found it at an estate sale in Westport from a jeweler who had been selling his grandmother's collection. When he'd seen it, he had known without calculation that it was right. She wore it on the right hand for now. When the time was appropriate, and they both knew what the time required, she would move it. There was no rush. They were in no hurry to explain themselves to anyone. Tonight, she turned the ring on her finger in the candlelight, the way you turn something you're still learning the weight of. A year ago, she said, you kissed me in this room. The library, he said, not this room. Close enough. She looked at him. Do you remember what I said? You said it couldn't happen again. It happened 4 days later. I remember. She smiled. The real one, the full one, the one that had been breaking him quietly since the night she walked into his father's dining room in white. What does that say about our discipline? That it has limits, he said. Like any well-designed structure. You build in the load-bearing walls, and you design for the weight you actually have, not the weight you intend to carry. She looked at him with that amused expression that she got when he was being exactly himself. That was the most architectural answer to a question about self-control I've ever heard. You asked an architectural question. She laughed, the full one, the one he'd first seen at the engagement announcement when she talked to her brother, the one he'd understood even then was who she really was. It changed the room the way it always changed rooms. He watched it happen and felt it land exactly where it always landed, which was somewhere in the load-bearing structure of himself. I want to tell you something, he said. You're stealing my line, she said. From a year ago, in the library. He paused. You told me what I gave you. I want to tell you what you gave me. She became still. She did that. He knew it now, the way she went still when she was fully present, when she was receiving rather than managing. I built this empire from the inside, he said. For 20 years, I held up the walls and managed the damage and calculated the cost of everything, every action, every relationship, every risk. I was the mechanism, the one who made it work. And I was good at it. He paused. But I was not in it. I was adjacent to my own life, present but not living it. She was looking at him with those eyes. You put me back in my own life, he said. You made it so that the calculating wasn't the whole of me. You gave me something to want that I couldn't optimize my way toward. You made me patient for the right reasons, instead of the strategic ones. He stopped, simplified. You made it real. She was quiet for a moment. Dante, she said. I know, he said. Stop saying I know. I know, he said again, and watched her try not to smile and fail. She reached across the table and he took her hand, his thumb over the emerald ring, and outside the city was doing what cities do in December. All cold air and glass light and the relentless ongoing fact of it. And inside the club, the quartet had shifted to something slow and Italian, something that sounded like it had been written for exactly this. Dance with me, she said. He raised an eyebrow. He did not dance. This was established. You own a nightclub, she said. That is irrelevant to whether I dance with me. Softer, not a demand, an offering. He stood up. He held out his hand. She took it, and he brought her to the small, clear space near the rail. The city spread below them through the glass, and he put his hand at the small of her back. No longer a conductor's gesture, no longer anything except what it was. And they moved to the music in the way that people move when they are not performing dancing, but simply being in the same space together in a way that requires contact. She rested her head against his shoulder. He held her. Below them, the city turned and breathed and conducted its infinite business. And above them, the December sky was the particular dark blue that comes before real cold. And in the club, the music played the only thing it had been asked to play, which was something that sounded like this. This. Finally, this. In our world, he said, into her hair, quietly. The thing he'd been carrying for a year and a half, and had finally found the right place to set down. She lifted her head to look at him. Betraying the family means death, he said. That's what they say. Is that what this is? She said. Betrayal? He thought about it. He thought about everything he'd built, and everything he'd earned, and everything he'd taken, and the cost of all of it, and what sat on the other side of the ledger. No, he said. This is what the family was always supposed to be for. This is the thing you build the walls to protect. He looked at her, directly, all the way in, with nothing held back, the way he'd been looking at her since the night he'd understood that looking away was a waste of the one life he had. You are what all of it was for. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she put her hand against his face, her palm on his jaw, and she looked at him with all of herself present and none of it managed, and she said, Then we'd better make sure the walls hold. He kissed her. Below them, the city held its breath. Above them, the sky went on doing what skies do. And in the narrow, brilliant space between them, between all they'd been and all they'd paid and all the dark miles they'd traveled to get here, something that had been building since a white dress walked through a candlelit door, finally, fully, arrived. The family would go on. The empire would go on. The world that they inhabited, its beauty and its violence, its loyalty and its cost, would go on doing what it had always done, which was demand everything and offer its particular rewards in the same hand. But here, in this, between them, here was the thing that made all the rest of it something other than just survival. Here was what had always been meant.